This is Keith.
And this is Ben, and this is Main Street Lutherans. This is our 45th episode, and for our intro segment on this episode, we want to talk about what we want to do for our 50th episode, which is coming up. That's almost 2 years of us producing this podcast, since we produce it every 2 weeks, which is a sort of a feat that I don't think we thought we'd get to, Keith.
Certainly not. I did not anticipate going more than a year, and let alone, I honestly thought we'd met maybe 10, maybe 20 episodes, and then we would have run out of things to say. But, put a couple of preachers on the air together, and I guess talking is not as hard as we think it is.
Well, and honestly, we wouldn't do it if folks weren't listening, so we really appreciate your feedback. We get a lot of emails and things these days, so really appreciate that. So what we thought we'd do for our 50th episode coming up in a few weeks is an Ask Us Anything thing. So what we're going to do is get some questions. If you've got questions about the show, about us, even little things about the ELCA, we may punt some of these into bigger episodes, but we'd be happy to answer these little things. So we'd love for you to email, call, message us on socials, any of those things. Send a carrier pigeon if you manage it, with any questions you've got, and we'll try to put a show together around that.
Yeah, the reason I think that we've made it nearly 50 episodes already is that we've had people ask good questions, give us suggestions for topics, for people to interview, for things about the church and what it is and what it could be. And that's partly what's kept us going.
Yeah. And so now for this episode, we've got a rather long interview with Dr. Mark Granquist from Luther Seminary. This is our third installment of the history that leads up to the formation of the ELCA. This takes us from basically the last 100 years, from, say, 1925 to 2025. This is a rather good talk about stuff that's much more contemporary. And so a lot of folks will know some of the things that happened in this, and some of it maybe not so much. So here is Dr. Mark Granquist.
So we are back today with Dr. Mark Granquist from Luther Seminary to speak with us again about the history of Lutheranism. We began this this is the third of 3 episodes. We had one that examined sort of the Reformation up until, I think it was about the 19th century. And then we went from there up to the early 20th century. And now today we're going to look at roughly the last 100 years or so, from right about 1925 to now 2025. So right about the last 100 years. So Dr. Mark Granquist, thank you so much for coming back to be with us again.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So when we left off, we had just, finished talking right about the sort of turn towards modernism, if you will, in American history, and how the Lutheran Church related to that. And so I think I could just invite you to, pick us up from there, and let's just see where things go.
Sure. The 1920s were a very interesting time for Lutherans because it was a time of tremendous change. The crisis point had been the First World War. Up until the First World War, a lot of the 19th century Lutherans were still working and singing and praying in their immigrant languages. They were hyphenated Americans, Swedish Americans, German Americans, Finnish Americans, and they were very much concerned with gathering in as many of the immigrants as they possibly could. Remember, immigration was actually peaking until 1914, and then it all came crashing down. And so they fully expected that immigration would pick up again, and it didn't, because the government shut down immigration. Then there was also the pressure during the First World War to become Americans. to speak English. And so from 1918 to 1930, there was a very rapid transition, a linguistic transition from using the immigrant languages. I mean, the East Coast Lutherans have been using English for a long time, but the bulk of the Lutherans, the Midwesterners, they were still using their immigrant languages. By 1930, those languages were dead. Really, I mean, it's a fascinating turn. And that means a whole bunch of different things. First of all, how can they justify being separate from each other if they're
Hmm.
all using English? The languages had been a major part of the identity of those smaller Lutheran synods, and some of them were actually pretty large. And so that was the question. The other question is, how do you do Lutheranism in English? And it sounds like a funny, line at this point. But, you know, translation is an art rather than as a science. And how do you translate the nuances of Lutheran confessional theology and worship into English? The first, I got to say, the first attempts were pretty wooden.
Mm-hmm.
So
So
they've got tremendous change.
which did they start with? The theology or the worship, the academic side or the sort of person in the pew
Oh,
side?
they were doing it both at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was, if you can imagine, it was, some people will remember the worship wars of the 80s and 90s when,
Mm-hmm.
the contemporary worship versus traditional worship and everything, and how people got upset about that. Well, you can imagine how the language transition played in congregations. I mean, it was war. It was war. There's one old guy who said, he said he was asked whether God understood English, and he thought about it for a while, and he thought about it for a while, and eventually said, "Yeah, well, God understands English. God just doesn't like it." So you got all these changes going on, and then of course American society is changing. All the Roaring Twenties, and then the Depression, and then the Second World War. It was a period of time when a lot was changing and people felt like, as they always do with change, right? Like, it's going too fast. I don't like this. I can't wait for it to happen. I mean, you just imagine the social dynamics of that.
I was talking with someone fairly recently in an interview setting. He spoke of his work context and he said, where I work, there's two things you can always rely on, that they can't stand for things to stay the same and they can't stand for things to change. And I think that's true in a lot of different contexts.
Right.
Can I ask you? I remember from one of our previous episodes, you were talking about as Lutheranism began spreading geographically in the US, that again, people are by and large staying in these cultural groups, but they're moving in the country to where the land is. And so we end up with sort of these pockets, some rather large pockets, some
Mhm.
smaller ones of Lutherans in various parts of the country, predominantly in kind of the mid Atlantic and the
Upper,
perhaps the
upper
northern
Midwest.
half of the Midwest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any spread from that in this period? Are there Lutheran churches or synods forming where there had not been any in the country?
That happens after the Second World War.
Okay.
Um, with people being dispersed all over the country, there's going to be an explosion of Lutheranism in the Sun Belt. In not so in Florida, definitely.
Mhm.
Not so much in the Gulf Coast. Texas, there had always been Lutherans there, but there are more now. But especially in the Southwest and California, uh,
Hmm.
Arizona and California. I mean, they were opening Lutheran congregations in the 50s and 60s left and right.
Hmm.
And
And that
So,
matches general demographics. People
oh
are
yeah,
generally moving
absolutely,
to those areas.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, they're forming sort of these are all Midwesterners or East Coasters, and they're all forming their little. I mean, they're replicating their home. They're having lutefisk dinners in Arizona.
Mm.
I don't know if they use I don't know if they use tortillas or not instead of levsa, but I mean, you know. So yeah, they are moving. They are definitely spreading. Lutheranism is moving into places where it had not previously been.
So when that happens, then is there a standardization? I think of McDonald's, right? The McDonald's, its key to growth was that it was uniform across
Mm.
from one restaurant to the next, and so if you stop in one town at a McDonald's, you get the same thing as you do 20 miles down the road or something. Is there an element of that going on
Oh,
with the church?
absolutely. I mean, the 20th century, especially the mid 20th century, just in everything there was standardization. It was larger and larger groups. The scale, the economies of scale, other sorts of things like this, and centralization. Okay. Um, Before 1930, there were very little what you would recognize as, shall I say, church headquarters.
Hmm.
Um, it was usually run by committee of pastors or things like that, and there was a part-time pastor who also was the head of the synod. But with the growth in size, that wasn't possible. But also the ideology of centralization. Centralization was good. Everybody doing the same thing. And so that was the mantra of these newly merged, large, centralized Lutheran denominations. And
Mm.
your analogy of McDonald's is spot on. Each new church, especially the new ones, were franchises. All right. And you used the denominational materials. You used the Sunday school curriculum. You used the stewardship program. You used all those sorts of things coming out of church headquarters. They would have these big national programs that everybody would be. And of course, the pastor who wanted to get ahead showed that he was playing ball, right? And so
Mm.
if you walked into a Lutheran church, you use the same hymnal, use the same order of worship. You walked into a Lutheran congregation in Portland, Oregon, and Portland, Maine, it would be the same.
Hmm.
So just one comment, because I use the word hymn, and of course at this point they all are
Yeah,
hymns. The
right,
pastors are all men.
right.
Then we'll come to that shift later. But also, is it fair to say that this same kind of trend in standardization and this towing the line, is this you know roughly contiguous with other faith traditions as well, other denominations in the country?
Oh,
You know,
absolutely.
the
Absolutely. And this is the period of the major Protestant mergers, right? Um,
Mhm.
and just see the number of times they talk about use the word united, the United Church of Christ, the United Presbyterians, the United Methodist Church, on and on and on. There was a point in the early 60s where they thought they would bring all the mainline Protestant groups together in a single thing. Well, that collapsed
Hmm.
pretty quickly, but still, the mantra was merger. Bigger is better.
Hmm.
We can have more of a voice. And so Lutherans spent most of the 20th century outside of Missouri merging.
Mhm.
And Missouri spent most of the 20th century not merging or avoiding mergers or whatever you could call it.
Yeah.
They didn't want to be marginalized, so they hung around on the sides and they wanted to be included, but then they wanted to be included on their own terms.
So 1950, say, how
Okay.
many Lutheran denominations are there? Recognizable ones, I
Of
guess.
a reasonable size.
Yeah.
Okay. You have the United Lutheran Church, the old colonial Lutherans, mainly in the East Coast and South, and they were about 1.7 million. All right. Missouri Synod, on the other hand, was about the same size. And in the middle, you had 8 churches in what was known as the National Lutheran the American Lutheran Conference. And these were the Norwegians, the Swedes, a couple of Danes, the Finns, a couple of Germans, kind of thing
And so
like
they're
that.
predominantly the Northern Midwesterners.
Yeah, Midwestern. Oh, yeah, just
Okay.
you had 2 large ones in the on either side, and then in between these 8 were roughly about the same size as Missouri and the ULCA.
Okay.
Okay.
Right? So you can divide the Lutherans into about thirds. About what would that make it? About 5.266 million, something like that.
Okay.
Okay. You said that's about the 1950s.
Yeah. Right after the war, then they're starting to the vision is to bring all the Lutherans together. This was the vision of Henry Muhlenberg in the 18th century, to bring all
Hmm.
the one Lutheran church for all Lutherans.
But it sounds
And
like it's more practical because now they're using the same hymnals and the same hymns
yep,
and the same liturgy, because I'm guessing this is when Fortress becomes our sort of common publishing house, or maybe a
well,
different
that doesn't
company.
happen until the ELCA in 1988. But
Oh, okay.
but they did bring out a common hymnal in the early 1950s for everybody but Missouri.
Okay.
And but even that didn't grease the skids on the merger. The mergers got complicated, and we ended up with 2 mergers rather than one. We had the LCA in 1962 and the ALC in 1960.
Okay.
And each of them
I could
had
give you
their
I
own.
could if we had 5 hours, I could tell you the ins and outs.
Sure.
The ALC and the LCA, they each had their own publisher. I forget which was which, but one of them was Fortress Press and the other was Augsburg, right?
Fortress was the LCA, Augsburg was the ALC, right?
And so in the merger of the ELCA, or the merger that created the ELCA, those two publishing houses merged as well and became Augsburg Fortress.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So the Missouri Synod at this point, are they like, how would you describe the Missouri Synod at this point? Are they their own independent, Lutheran body that happens to be, is it roughly contiguous with Missouri in this moment? Is it bigger than that?
It's a national church.
Okay.
Even in the 19th century, it was the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri and other states.
Okay.
And Missouri is it's its heyday. You look at golden eras or something like that, but in the 50s and 60s, it was a very prominent religious player on the American scene. They had a lot of really sharp people. And still do, but I'm just saying, but there was always this sort of internal divide within Missouri, of which eventually they named the moderates and the conservatives. I don't know that those terms really help all that much, but the question was, um, how much do you have to do to be in fellowship with other Christians, other Lutherans? How much agreement? The other groups, the groups that eventually became the ALC and LCA and then ELCA, said, "Look, we'll never engineer a merger if we have to have a doctrinal agreement on absolutely every point. Let's agree on the let's agree on what's the important things, and then the details. We'll work with the details." Missouri's standpoint had always been and still is that you have to have absolute agreement in doctrine before there can be even church fellowship, exchange of pastors and other kinds of things like this. And to their credit, they are consistent about this. Right? You may like it, you may not like it, but they have been very consistent upon this. But there was in the 50s and 60s, there was a sort of an undercurrent of some people wanting to the moderates wanting to have more relationship with other American Lutherans, and the conservatives who were still very suspicious. And in the 60s, the moderates were more or less in control in Missouri. They had the St. Louis Seminary and the president. Actually, in 1967, a major thing happened, which was the formation of the Lutheran Council in the USA, which brought together for cooperative work, not fellowship, but cooperative work, LCA, ALC, and the Missouri Synod. That's what caused, for example, the strictly confessional Wisconsin Synod to break with Missouri.
Hmm.
Okay. So the first time, now, that wasn't a merger, it wasn't fellowship, but it was, we're moving in the right direction here. We're going together, kind of thing like that.
And then,
And then,
and then we've talked about ordination of women, and that seems to be the big triggering event that broke that up. At least that Missouri Synod left that partnership.
well, there are lots of different issues, but in the late 1960s, this LUCUSA sponsored a theological working group on the question of women's ordination. And, LUCUSA was very careful. They didn't want to say that they were going to tell any of the three-member denominations what to do. But they came out with this report that was really, I think, fairly balanced, actually. This and that and other kinds of things like that. And the ALC and the LCA adopted the recommendations of the report, and the report basically said that there's nothing to stand in the way of a Lutheran denomination from ordaining women. It didn't say you have to be Lutheran, you have to ordain women or something like that. They were very careful about that. And so the ALC and LCA said yes, Missouri said no. So the other thing that happened in 1969, which was very strange, there was a convention of the Missouri Synod in which a very conservative Lutheran J.A.O. Preuss was elected president. But they also, the same convention, declared pulpit and altar fellowship with the American Lutheran Church, the ALC.
Huh.
That was Missouri had never done that before.
Hmm.
And they knew that the ALC was going to start ordaining women. So now you had the possibilities of a ALC woman pastor now being able to preach from the pulpit of a Missouri Synod church.
Can I ask why the ALC and not the LCA?
The LCA was considered to be too liberal. There were some historical relationships between the ALC and the Missouri Synod.
Okay, so there are already some smaller differences of opinion between these bodies.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
But then of course things got very conservative in Missouri. Now it's interesting enough that the conventions in the Missouri Synod conventions in 69, 73, the conservatives won, but not by much. It was generally a 55-45 split. Okay. But the conservatives very quickly took institutional control. And that's what led to the problems at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis.
And that is a story I didn't learn about until I was, headed to college. Mm-hmm. And I went to Wartburg Seminary, mm-hmm. and I saw a mural, and someone explained to me that was about Seminex. And I got a 5-minute explanation of what happened. which turns out, isn't anywhere near enough time to explain what it is. But then I also found out my pastor at my church was there in 74. And I've run into maybe 10 other pastors that went through that experience. So it had a much stronger impact on the church that is the ELCA now than I think most of us younger folks had any idea.
There's a whole history there to be written.
Yeah.
And it's okay. So let me go back and then I'll get to that point. Okay.
Yeah.
Feel free to take more than 5 minutes if necessary.
Yes.
um, the point of attack, Preuss's point of attack was the leadership and the faculty at Concordia Seminary, who were pretty much mostly moderates. And by taking control of the board of the seminary and other sorts of things like this, eventually tried to get to throw out or was going to throw out the president of the seminary, John Tejan. Okay. Most of the students and most of the faculty were supporting Tejan, and at a certain point, they chose to walk out of the seminary and form their own, what was called Christ Seminary in Exile, or very popularly Seminex. Okay. Now that happened, and then it went. The seminary was formed first as a at least initially as a temporary kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the denomination was formed around the seminary because you got to have just somewhere to send your pastors, right? And so the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Congregations was formed a couple of years afterwards, of the walkout. Now, they really expected, well, you can think of 45-55 split, they sort of expected that they would get, maybe upwards of a million people leaving Missouri Synod to this new AELC. It didn't work. Most of the moderates stayed in the Missouri Synod and figured out they're just going to work with the system. And only about 100,000 came out of Missouri into the AELC. It was a denomination that really just was not. It wasn't feasible at that point. But you see the thing, and if you think of AELC was top heavy with pastors and seminary professors and college professors and leadership, and they all had to go somewhere. And AELC had no, they couldn't employ all these people. In fact, Seminex was barely hanging on. And so what they did is they dispersed these people to Chicago, to Wartburg, to other sorts of places. And so the career of all of these Missouri exiles is, like I said, somebody really needs to study it. The impact that it had on eventually on the new ELCA was very large and I would say disproportionate.
Now, the congregations that switched, were they geographically in particular areas, or were they split out pretty wide?
All over the country.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And how many graduates did Seminex produce? I mean, they existed for what, 10, 15, 20 years?
Oh no, no more than 6 or 7. I mean, I was at LSTC.
Okay.
I was at LSTC as a student, as a special student in the early 1980s, and Seminex was still there, but it very quickly got absorbed eventually into the other thing. I want to say another thing about Missouri. All right, Missouri was like this family on steroids. Okay. And especially the clergy. They're huge, clergy dynasties people who were,
Mm.
um, families where there were, 8, 10, 12 uncles, cousins, brothers, sons who were pastors, all right? And this destroyed a lot of those families,
Mm.
um, because people went one direction or another. And I mean, I've heard the stories, and people are literally sometimes we're literally in tears because of the divisions that it caused in the in their families. And we never take that into account.
Mm. So it really is like some of the families in the border states beginning of the Civil War.
Yeah. Yeah,
Wow.
divorce.
Mm.
Um, and so, I mean, there have been some, I mean, think about the people who came out of Missouri, Yaroslav Pelikan, Martin Marty, um, a lot of really cream of the crop American religious leaders and intellectuals.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah. The pastor that confirmed me was a Seminex graduate. So I was one of the associates at my first call. And, as a student at Trinity Seminary, I studied homiletics under
Hmm.
Paul Harms, who was part of the faculty walkout.
Right. And then, of course, Missouri had to rebuild. It is, and so it's been tough on Missouri. Um, it's been tough on Missouri to rebuild the seminary and everything else like that.
Was there are there any ways in which the purge, if you want to use that term, was helpful to them, or was it really just they're stuck having to start over? Was there like a sense of consolidation of power, or finally the people that stay get their own way?
Well, this wasn't my idea, but I can understand it. All right. Um, but I've heard people who have said eventually that the walkout was a mistake because it allowed Preuss and his people to um, to get control of the seminary. If they had stayed, I don't know what history is always what if,
Hmm.
what if, this had happened or that had happened. You never really know. But some people have said that it allowed it allowed Preuss and his team to rebuild the seminary in the way they wanted it, without having to a messy eviction of the students and the faculty and everything like that. Because a lot of the faculty lived in houses there, seminary-owned houses.
Hmm.
So,
So did that move the seminary to the more conservative side then? Did
well, yes, I mean, definitely. Let's put it this way. I mean, they were much more careful. The moderates, and Missouri has always said that the moderates were really liberals in disguise. And if you follow the career
Hmm.
of some of the people who left Missouri, you can you can understand that language.
Hmm.
But remember, this was this late 60s, early 70s. I mean, you guys were just born then, but um this you think we're polarized now? You imagine what America was like in the late 60s and early 70s.
Oh, sure.
We are much less polarized now than we were back then.
So this is my assessment at this point is that because the tipping point at the St. Louis Seminary, because it happened before there was a plan for what to do necessarily. Well, there was a plan for the students and for the faculty, but they hadn't brought congregations with them at that point. So they didn't have a plan on what to do after the walkout. And so it took a couple of years for the denomination to be formed to try to absorb this. And it just knowing how Americans work, once that initial thing happened, people sort of they settled back into their old habits
Mhm.
and said, well, it's too big of a risk to go off on this new thing, so we're going to leave our congregation where it is, and we're going to avoid these seminary graduates because the structure we're in doesn't want us to take them. Does that seem about right?
That's about right. I mean, just remember that it's very difficult. Church divisions are very difficult,
Hmm.
and especially for pastors. I sometimes joke, and I'm not always sure it's a joke, but sometimes the only thing that's keeping the church together is the church pension plan.
Sure.
All right. Pastors worry about their pensions. They worry about mobility. Can I get a call? Should I just, and Missouri was structured in a rather congregational way that Missouri can't come in to a congregation and tell it what to do. That goes back to the beginnings of the Missouri Synod. So they can push the seminarians around all they want, but they can't. There's a lot less that they can do to if And the idea is basically I keep my congregation happy, and then I'll be okay. And the further I can keep St. Louis away from me, the better. But then there's also a lot of ELCA pastors that say that too,
Sure.
right?
Right. I was actually just going to say there's a lot of ELCA bishops that say that there's not a lot that they can do in congregations.
They can't. They can't. I mean, if you look at the actual juridical power of an ELCA bishop, they have virtually none. Which is the
Right.
only thing they can do is sign or not sign a call, which is a power. But
Hmm.
but I would say then too that Seminex put the ball in motion to the formation of the ELCA in 1988. A number of reasons. First of all, the AELC was not stable, and so it was not being able. It was not as a denomination. It was not able to function as well as it needed to. The second thing is it destroyed the idea. A lot of people in the 60s, they thought Missouri would come around.
Mm.
And finally, they basically said, look, waiting for Missouri it's not going to happen. And so that starts the ball rolling, and they're saying, well, why should we have ALC and LCA and AELC? Let's do that.
Mm. So I have two
Go ahead. Go ahead.
questions. Um, the first, and I don't know which order you want to answer them in. The first is so the Seminex movement, um, in a simplistic sense, is sort of the externalizing of the conflict that had up to that point been inside the Missouri Synod. So they took it out and created an us and them. So the first question I have is there a similar internal movement? You said that some of these congregations and other leaders chose to stay. Was there an attempt to push back against this conservative movement inside the Missouri Synod? And if so, to what extent did it prevail or not prevail? And then the second question is, do I struggle with, I feel like we paint J.A.O. Preuss as a bad guy, and I've always been curious, like what was his motivation as a person, as a churchman? What did he hope to accomplish with this? And and to what extent do you think he felt successful or not?
Well, yeah, let's take the first one first. And I don't know. I never met him, and so I would be kind of cautious about that. He was consistent, all right? Um, he didn't he didn't blow with he wasn't a politician in that sense, that, kind of wanting to make everybody happy. All right. Uh,
Hmm.
he was a politician in the sense of he knew how to work with power. All right. Um, I don't, personally, I don't know what else to say about him in that sense, except that he was not a he felt that the confessional nature of the Missouri Synod was in danger, and he did what he thought he needed to do to make sure that it remained a purely confessional Lutheran church. That's where I would go on that one. What was the
Maybe
other
a was there an attempt inside the Missouri
inside?
Synod to
Yeah.
push back against? And I
Well,
guess a tangential question to both of those is, was this going to happen either way? Did was the election of J.E.O. Forrest like the catalyst for where the change in the Missouri Synod came from, or was that just more of a symptom, if you will?
causality in history is really tough to
Sure.
figure out. I
No,
don't
I
know
appreciate
how
that.
you figure that out. There have been I mean, there are tensions within the Missouri Synod, as there are within the ELCA. There have been some groups that have, I don't know what the status of they are. They never, people will say that, for example, the prior Missouri Synod president, a man named Kieschnick, was more on the moderate side of things, and that the current one, Harrison, is more conservative. How you figure those scales? I really don't know. Uh,
Hmm.
there was this big internal upset in Missouri when this at 9/11 and a memorial service for the
Hmm.
9/11, this district president of the Missouri Synod was up on the stage, and was he praying with them or not? It's like a whole other story. But so there have been tensions, but not organized ones that I know of.
Okay, so we get to this point where we've got this smaller group of Lutherans that have I would imagine the AELC folks had a lot of energy from that split. They took some initiative, and that doesn't go away easily.
And a lot of phobias.
Sure,
I mean, when you're burned by one church organization, you're not going to set yourself up to be burned by another.
sure.
And
Hmm.
so the AELC in my reading struggled with a lot of trust issues.
Sure.
Tejan became the first ELCA bishop in Chicago and didn't last very long there.
Hmm.
I don't know why he left his bishop post in Chicago to go to Texas. But once you've been pushed around by denominational bureaucrats, you're not likely to to want to stay. But of course, then this leads to the ELCA, and the ELCA, of course, is formed in relation to this. And the interesting thing about the formation of the ELCA in 1988 was this new process for bringing it together. The old church mergers had been brought about in the proverbial smoke-filled back rooms with the denomination. The people who ran the denomination knew what they were doing, and
Mhm.
they could hammer out somebody like Franklin Clark Fry, who was the president of the ULCA. I mean, he knew how to get things done, and there were a whole generation of people that did that. The process in the 80s was specifically designed not to be that kind of process.
Hmm.
It was going to be representative. You're going to bring in these new voices. You're going to bring in a new generation. You're going to bring in women. You're going to bring in people who are not white. You're going to have quotas and other sorts of things like that. So when the ELCA was formed, it was formed with a lot of grand ideas. All right. Unfortunately, the denominational leaders sometimes knew what they were doing. And when the ELCA was formed, it was formed with it was way over organized.
Hmm.
It was top heavy with a superstructure, and they decided to sort of shove under the carpet for later consideration three very divisive issues. The question of the nature of the ministry,
Mhm.
the question of ecumenical relations, and worst of all, sexuality. They did not solve those. They said the new ELCA can do that. What that condemned the ELCA was to a decade of upheaval.
Hmm.
And the other thing is that structure, that superstructure, also meant that they were um, woefully undercapitalized.
Hmm.
Their economic projections, their revenue projections were somewhere out of Alice in Wonderland. And and so the church was the new ELCA was immediately thrown into a series of crises.
Hmm.
Economic crisis, and then all the other things that they had to solve.
Yeah, as a podcast, we've talked about. I don't know. We've directly addressed synods yet, but we talk about the national organization, church-wide organization, and we talk about the synods and the local congregations. But there was this layer in the middle, the regional
The region,
layer,
right?
which doesn't seem to have much structure anymore.
No, because there's no money.
Yeah,
I mean, there used to be there was a clear reason for the regions between the synods and the national church. There were supposed to be leaders in them. There was, theological education was supposed to be worked through them. It was sort of an attempt to decentralize a little bit.
yeah,
And of course, they were just expensive and very quickly faded out of any real. I mean, they really more or less exist only on paper at this point.
yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Mark, for the sake of people who, you know, don't know this, I
Okay.
won't name whether I'm one of them or not. But can you say a little bit about those three um, issues that they said they pushed under the rug? Just a sentence or two about
Right.
what each one was at that time.
Okay. I mean, the question of the ministry was, traditionally Lutherans had believed that had held for 450 years that there was a single ministry. All right. You were called to a single office of word and sacrament. Now, from that office of word and sacrament, people were called to specialized calls like teaching and chaplaincy and other sorts of things like that. And lay leaders could be they could be recognized in many ways, but they were not pastors. Okay. Now, of course, the higher church folk in Lutheranism always pushed for the model of a threefold model of ministry, which would be you're ordained deacon, then you're ordained pastor or priest, and then you're ordained a bishop. Okay.
Hmm.
And there was a strong element of what we would call the evangelical Catholics, who were Lutherans with a definite high church leaning, who wanted that very much of a threefold office of ministry. And so the National Convention spent several years hashing that out. Eventually, you know, eventually they let's put it this way: the people who want the threefold office of ministry have never given up on it. And so they're futzing around with the office of deacon, and they're, stuff about what our bishops are not ordained, but what are they? They're consecrated or set apart.
Hmm.
there's always a lot of, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, it is a duck.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And yet, the deacons that we've had on this show have made it very clear that they are not pastors in training.
right.
They are
Right.
deacons, and yeah.
Are you ordained to being a deacon?
Hmm.
I see there's a lot of futzing around with that. Second thing, all right, ecumenical relations. Who do you want to have ecumenical relations with? Uh, some of the more moderate folks in the ELCA wanted to, go in one direction. The sort of evangelical Catholics and the others wanted to get, especially with the Episcopalians, but also with if they could do it with closer to the Roman Catholics, and they wanted the ELCA to look more like the Roman Catholics and the Episcopal Church. And of course, that was leading up to this great big uh, problem that we had with the ecumenical agreement with the Episcopalians
Hmm.
that so convulsed the church in the late 1990s and
That
led
was the
to
one that was called to Common Mission. Is that
all
what
the
that one was
common
called?
mission was the second one of it.
Okay,
Right.
that's right.
So there was the question about who you wanted to be ecumenical with. And then third of all, I don't have to explain what the sexuality issue was. The question of or the ordination of gay pastors.
Hmm.
And that hit the fan several times before and crashed and burned several times before it finally was adopted in 2009.
Hmm.
And of course, what that has meant then too is a major schism. See that this actually the AELC was minor in terms of a walkout. I mean, it happened all at once and it was very dramatic and everything else like that.
Right.
But somewhere to the point, there are two new centrist Lutheran denominations, the Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ and the North American Lutheran Church, which now represent, I think maybe off the top of my head, 800,000 Lutherans.
Hmm.
So you compare to, it's what I call a slow motion schism.
Hmm.
It didn't happen overnight. It happened over 20 years,
Hmm.
and it's still happening. All right. And the real catalyst was the sexuality study in
Right.
2009. How many congregations and people we lost? Well, officially, I think the ELCA's official records was that they lost 500,000 members in 2 years following the second. But that doesn't take into account people who dropped out and you know congregations it, you know people may have been still on the records, but they weren't there anymore.
Yeah.
Mm.
And a lot of the congregations that did leave were, well, some of the biggest congregations were ones that left, which meant that you may have lost one congregation out of, 150 in a synod or something, but you might lose, well above that in membership and money.
And
Mm.
money. And remember, those big congregations were like synods in and of themselves. They
Mhm.
didn't need the ELCA. The
Right.
ELCA needed them.
Yeah. I was in the bishop's office. I was in Bishop Sauer's office in Southern Ohio when one of those churches called in. This would have been 1990-ish, and declared that they were starting their own seminary. And Bishop Sauer was not someone to take news like that very well.
No.
And so, but yeah, those churches, I think those churches that had their own independence because of their numbers could afford to leave.
The interesting thing is that these two new Lutheran denominations have a sort of a barbell shape curve. In other words,
Hmm.
they've got a number of very large congregations, and then they have a lot of small congregations.
Yeah.
And what's
Hmm.
missing is sort of the mid-sized congregations in the middle.
Yeah. So there we have so our 1988 is it's confusing whether the ELCA comes together in 88 or 89.
It
It's
starts in 88.
it starts in 88.
January 1, 88, because
Okay.
I was ordained in the summer of 1988, and I was ordained into the ELCA.
Okay. I think did then the congregations voted on it? I forget how that process happened.
In the ALC, yes, the congregations had to vote on it.
Okay.
The LCA did not have that mechanism, which has
Okay.
become a sore point. And I can't remember what the ALC had to do one way or another. But
Okay.
and the interesting thing is that as you find that now you've got the big two, you've got the ELCA and you've got Missouri. The ELCA especially came together at this point in time in which that whole question of centralization and unification and uniformity and everything like that. American business, American other groups had discarded that a long time ago.
Hmm.
I mean, if you walk into any dozen Lutheran congregations in a major city, right? Like say Minneapolis, you will find 12 very different worship styles, theological viewpoints, mission, all those kinds of things. Because basically what the congregations have realized is that it's what you might call niche marketing. You know, there is there's a congregation in the Twin Cities that I don't know if they still do, but they used to advertise themselves as the alternative to alternative worship. Okay.
Yeah.
But in a to how do you know in a world of McDonald's, how do you stand out? Well, you don't.
Hmm.
You you do something different. You do tacos or you do subs or you do, whatever it is. So the church got unified, the ELCA got unified, but let a thousand flowers bloom because virtually, I mean, nobody uses, this is the Augsburg Fortress is tearing their hair out because nobody uses their curriculum anymore.
Hmm.
You know, where they could always, every year they brought out a new curriculum and everybody would
Yeah.
use it. Now, no,
Yeah.
that's not the way it is.
Well, and not long after that, we'd get the beginning of the emergent church movement and all that too. So there are all sorts of influences that sort of tear at
Yeah,
that
right.
set. So
But in other words, okay, I'll use this as a figure for this, all right? The good part of this, or good, bad, or otherwise, okay? It used to be that for example, a congregation back in the 19th century would see that there's a group of Lutherans over here that weren't being served, and so the pastor went over there and tried to get them together, and they supported them, and there were these pastors that developed satellite congregations, like 8, 10, 12 congregations around a mother church, right?
mhm.
Mission was done by the pastors. All right, setting up new churches and everything like this. In the bureaucratic centralization, congregations were planted and what they did, they planted hundreds, thousands of new congregations in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, but on a very strict basis. And you walk into they even sent you the plans, the architectural plans for your first
Hmm.
unit, your second unit, and everything else like that. And
Yeah.
of course, you used the hymnal, you used the Sunday school curriculum, you supported the denominational programs.
Right.
Uh, but now,
Yeah. Calvary, Ben, where you and I met, was one of those buildings.
Oh,
yeah.
sure.
Now,
Yeah.
a student told me this about 10 years ago, and he said there was a large congregation in Southern California that saw that there was an area that needed a Lutheran church. And they said that they would provide half of the operating budget for that new church start if 6 other congregations would support the other half.
Huh.
Right? And so the pastor went around to try to get that going, and the synod stepped in and said, no, you can't do this. It has to go through the channels. And that new mission start collapsed because now I think the bishops would say, great, yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead. But it's a change in culture, and that's a very difficult thing to do, is to change a culture. And the drawback is on that maybe mission doesn't get done, right?
Right.
New congregations don't get formed. I don't know. Maybe the emergent church is a model, although I have my doubts about it. But
Yeah, I think it's sort of spun out. I think it's declared its end. So, but there's pieces of it still around us.
oh sure, oh
and
sure.
and so
Well, and the models now of the big mega churches with the satellite congregations all around them. I mean,
right,
Lutheran Church of Hope in Des Moines, for example.
sure,
So, but some works and some doesn't, and there's always you never can tell
yeah,
with these things. I mean, we won't know what COVID did to American Christianity for 20 years. I'd say
right,
20 years minimum.
yeah, yeah. We're still reacting to the impact. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Well, I think that takes us up to 2025. We have
I think
we're about to install a new bishop here in a few weeks, and
Mhm.
we've got a lot of things coming this way. We'll be re taking another look at our sexuality statements. We've done the rewriting, the language. We talked with Imran Siddiqui about that, and it sounds like in 3 years we'll have a chat about some of the content. So these are issues that we
The
haven't
big, the
completely
big,
finished with.
the big question will be how directive the bishops and the synods can be in um, strongly urging congregations to take
Mhm.
gay and lesbian pastors. Um, if they go too far that direction, if they start interfering with congregational choice, you will see another mass defection from the ELCA. If it appears that the synods will make this or try to make this happen, it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah.
So just that, remember the interesting thing about the sexuality study, and I would just say this. Interesting thing about the sexuality study is that the ELCA has no position on questions of sexuality. It has no official position. If you read the ELCA study that was passed in, or the thing that was passed in 2009, it says some believe this way, some believe
Right.
this way, some believe this. We're going to try to live together and kind of thing like this.
Right.
So it's always been a balancing point, and conservatives or moderates in the ELCA can say, well, the ELCA does not have an official position, which it doesn't.
Well, then I guess one of the questions that remains then is how broad can the spectrum be and still hold together?
Exactly.
It's back to that same point of, how much can we disagree and still, be church together?
Are we devolving? I mean, structurally.
Mm-hmm.
Missouri has managed to hang together. It still has its moderates and conservatives, and there's a lot of tension, but they're still hanging together. The ELCA, like I said, these two new centrist groups have really, have grown rather dramatically.
Well, Dr. Granquist, it's been great to have you on the show again.
Thank you.
This being able to look at the roots of our Lutheranism and sort of see where the things that we're watching our churches, the things that our churches are doing and seeing where their roots go. They're not something we just came up a few weeks ago. They come from centuries of dialogue and understanding and tradition. And I think that's always important to know where our feet come from, where they're
Can,
rooted.
can I just say one more thing?
Absolutely.
Historians are very wary about making any kind of predictions because they've seen historians in the past make predictions that were
Sure.
completely and utterly wrong. And most historians like their subjects dead and buried before they talk about them. So, I mean, my particular view on where we are and the recent past, I could be completely wrong. And I just want to say that 50, 75 years, somebody will look back and say, that fool Granquist, what did he think he was saying? Because I've said it about historians in the past myself. So,
Yes. Yeah.
but
That's
Absolutely.
fair. Thank you.
Yeah. And just a note, we'll put links in the episode notes, but Dr. Granquist has a book, Lutherans in America: A New History, that they can give you a deep down and detailed look at Lutheranism as it progressed through the United States, and highly recommended. So
thank you. Thank
so
you.
thank you for spending some more
Yeah.
time with us.
And thank you for the time.
Maybe
Thank
in
you.
another 50
Yeah,
years we'll
and
do
thank
this
you.
again.
Yeah,
We'll talk about another 50
Dig,
years.
dig me up.
That's right.
absolutely. Thank you for not just this episode, but for the previous two as well. It's really been I think helpful to our listeners to have this overview of where we come from. Thank you for your time.
Well, thanks again, Dr. Granquist. This has been a great conversation that we've had over 3 episodes. We'll have links to the prior episodes in the episode notes and links to Dr. Granquist's book, several books actually about Lutheranism and different parts. Luther Seminary being one of those two. So as far as this conversation, well, so normally at this point we would start into our better know a congregation or a synod, but this episode's pretty long already, so we're just going to wrap this up pretty quick. Get some maybe just have some discussion among ourselves about this overall thing. The history of Lutherans in America has really taken us from beginning to end, I think. We started with the
Mhm.
Reformation, so how much further back could we go, right?
Yeah, 3 episodes covering 3 pretty distinct but very long time periods is that's a lot to chew on.
Yeah.
This last one really seems to show that the 20th century and the earlier parts of the 21st century have demonstrated a lot of compromises in the history of what becomes the ELCA and the bodies leading up to it. And sometimes the compromise was to ignore the differences that we shared.
Yeah, and that's kind of the growing pains that we're in right now, right?
Yeah, it's this tension that we're kind of constantly wrestling with as not just a denomination, but sort of the church at large in a way.
This conversation's been reminding me of meeting folks from Canada, and there's a United Church of Canada, which
Mm.
is several denominations that merge together. Now there's still a Lutheran Church of Canada, and there's still an Episcopal Church of Canada, and things, but there's a lot of Presbyterians and what would be UCC congregations in Canada sort of merged together to form this bigger church. And I think there was a time when people in our mainline denominations thought we would all merge together and be
Mhm.
one. And it's kind of a sign that we've got a lot of differences between us, that we even have a hard time holding a single Lutheran denomination together.
Yeah, yeah. It's this constant tension that keeps coming up of what does it mean to maintain your identity? Is it holding on tightly to that which is uniquely yours at the expense of being in relationship with people who are not uniquely who are uniquely themselves? And I think it becomes this kind of war of not war, but this tension, like I say, between, the desires to remain together despite your differences, which I think has, some strong Christian roots, right?
Yeah.
Or the notion of taking a stand and holding yourself separate from that which you hold to be too different, too heterodox, if you want to. Do we pack up our ball and go home, or do we fight to try to stay united with people with whom we disagree?
Yeah.
And where does the strength lie? Does the strength lie in staying together despite your differences? Does the strength lie in trying to bring people along from within who are not like you? Does the strength lie in taking a stand and trying to get others to come along with you, or in walking away in order to maintain what you feel is core, and inviting others to come with you or not, but still walking away? There's strength, pride, identity, in all of those, and it's tough sometimes to figure out which one to lean into.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that a lot of these things that are these separations aren't theological problems; they're organizational problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's how much power does the church-wide organization have versus the synod versus the congregations are three expressions of the church, and we have people fighting that out constantly, and sometimes people walk away on that, not actually a scripture-based or theologically based problem, right? Sometimes it's something that's tinged with theology, but often it's how much power does a certain layer of the church have over the others.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we look forward to hearing from everybody to get ready for our 50th episode. You can use our contact information there or email us at mainstreetlutherans@gmail.com. Main Street Lutherans is hosted by Keith Fair and Ben Fote, and the show is produced by Fote Media Productions. Find all our contact information, links, and a transcript in the episode notes. Until next time, go in peace, serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.